Hey Timmy, good to see you.
Good to see you too. How are you doing, Roman?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine. Working hard on several papers at the moment.
Oh yeah. Okay, cool. I think I should introduce myself first since I'm like appearing on this MetaEthos channel for the first time. But first of all, just a warm welcome to anyone who's listening to this, to the MetaEthos podcast episode number 1. So today's topic will be on from greenwashing to eco-terrorism, which is a topic Dr. Roman is very interested in. And just about myself, I used to be a student in philosophy more than a decade ago. And after that, I started working in digital marketing. And I also have a degree in marketing as well. So I am a bit at the intersection. So intellectually and professionally speaking, at the intersection of, you know, marketing, consumer culture, and philosophy as well. So I like to think about these things. And because I'm just the host, I'm just the stupid guy here asking the questions on topics that I don't really know much about. So this is kind of the dynamic we're going to expect here. Is that right, Dr. Roman?
No, you already know a lot about that stuff because we regularly talk about it. So yes.
Right. Let's see. Let's see. Okay. Yes, so today's topic, from greenwashing to eco-terrorism. And I think we need to set the stage first and think about what greenwashing actually is. So I want to start with an example. Last week, I went to H&M. I think that's a company that's been spoken and reported about quite a lot in terms of environmental friendliness. So last week I went to H&M after not having gone there for quite a while, and like I'm going into the men's section, looking at what they have, and then within the men's section they have this really tiny, smaller section where they have their eco-friendly and green kind of line of clothing, right? And it's really small. It's just maybe 5 different products, mostly t-shirts, right? So I was thinking, first of all, in terms of for a company like H&M, what does it mean? Would that be an example of greenwashing? And then, of course, what greenwashing actually is. I don't know if you have any opinion on that, and if you can start explaining what greenwashing actually is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the term greenwashing probably derived from whitewashing, right? When you pretend that something is in a particular quality, but it isn't, right? And uh, especially in regard to environmental issues, right? So I think one of the worst greenwashing cases has been the Volkswagen Dieselgate affair, when Volkswagen um, pretended that their cars are environmentally friendly, that there is very little emission, right? And in fact, they had a kind of electronic cheating device which switched off the emission cleaning when the car was in test condition. But when the car was on the normal road, in the normal driving condition, then the car was emitting, I don't know how many times more the promised uh, emission, right? And so this is the typical a typical example, one of the worst examples of greenwashing, and this was very expensive for Volkswagen because instead of already battery electric cars, right, they were already somewhat on the agenda, and instead of switching to at least hybrid cars or having one or the other car experimenting with it, right, they committed this greenwashing act, right? And we know where the German car industry stands right now, right? And Volkswagen was not the only company that engaged in greenwashing, right? And internally, I heard, I'm not sure if this is true, but internally, this project was called Emission Possible, right? Not Mission Impossible, but Emission Possible. So emission is possible on the road, but once the car is in testing condition, then this testing device kicks in and in fact cleans the car. But then the performance of the car, the performance of the engine went down drastically, and this is why they didn't want to have it, right?
So
So
how would
that's
you how would you define then greenwashing as a term or as a framework, for example, that we can apply to different to whatever company? So I mean, maybe I'm not too familiar with Volkswagen in particular. I just read about it, but for me as a consumer, then how do I, let's say, in the consumer process, how do I identify whether a company is greenwashing or not before even like a scandal comes out? So how would you define greenwashing, and how can we
okay. So
identify?
yeah. So there are two questions, right? How to identify it, and how to define it. Um, I mean, I think the definition of greenwashing ranges between what the philosopher Harry Frankfurt called bullshitting, right? So if you are not really serious about your statements that you are making, but you try to capture attention on the one hand, right, where you're not that serious about what you are saying, you try to capture attention, to on the other hand, lying, right? So Volkswagen was clearly lying. But then there are also other companies, they are kind of bullshitting. So there are some brands, for example, which label salt GMO free, right? But salt is always GMO free, right? This is also a kind of um, greenwashing because non-GMO is perceived as a kind of positive value of a product. But if you label something that cannot be genetically modified anyway, and you label that GMO free, that is pretty dishonest, or maybe the marketing department simply didn't think about it, right? And thought, okay, we are not manipulating this genetically, so it's GMO free, right? But it's the same as if you say your laptop is GMO free, or my glasses are GMO free, or whatever. Okay, they could be practically GMO free because it's a natural product. Yeah, and well, to detect it, I mean, the Volkswagen car customers, they of course did not detect that, right? They were not in a position, so it took the environmental agency in the US to detect it. So they had a suspicion, and so they used some special devices which they could load into the trunks of the car, which could test the emission while driving. And this is how they found out, right? But because usually emission is tested in the garage, right? And then the device detected that the back wheels, for example, are not turning. So that means the car is in a garage in testing condition. And so the cleaning device kicks in, right? So that's clear lying, right? But this is not something the customer would be able to detect, right? This is not easy for a customer. You don't have a device where you can measure that. Then sometimes you mentioned H&M, right? So a couple of years ago, and I think that's already 6 or 5 years ago, I was in an H&M in Germany and was quite surprised about the range of recycled and organic products they had. And but some of that was not clearly labeled, right? So I mean, it was labeled as cotton from recycled and organic cotton, right? And so if you label that, I'm not sure if this is even against the labeling legislation in Germany, but here for the consumer, it is not. It's not that clear, right? How much is now recycled cotton? How much is organic cotton? And so in Thailand, it's even worse, right? If you ask people, if you buy something in a shop, things are not labeled at all, right? And if you ask, is it cotton? They say, yeah, it's cotton, right? Because with cotton, they mean it's made from cloth, right? It's not glass or metal or plastic, or it may be plastic, right? But it is made from cloth, right? And this is what they mean by cotton. But yeah, so these things genetically modified, this is something you cannot detect as a customer. I mean, the only thing is that you can read on blogs, consumer reviews, if people who intensively research about something, if they have found out something from the press or from other websites. So this is the best I think you can do, right? Inform yourself online.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that means at the moment there's no government regulation on or consumer protection laws that specifically for eco-friendly product labeling.
Well, I mean, definitely not worldwide, right? So each country may have or will have some specific laws, right? But I thought that the German government is relatively strict, right? But whenever I visit Germany and I buy some whatever, nuts and chips and then open the package, I'm quite surprised that it's half empty already or half full, right? Depending if you're an optimist or a pessimist. But basically, you don't need such a big pack uh, to 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 um, to pack this small amount of nuts, right? And this is definitely a case of greenwashing, and I'm still surprised that this is possible. Or these. Not sure if you have ever bought yogurt and turned the yogurt around and check the bottom, right? So some of these yogurt um, packagings, they have concave bottom, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Or if you go to Sizzler, right? We both like Sizzler. If you go to Sizzler, you will notice the plates. They're pretty small, right? For the salad bar. If you just go for the salad bar, the look closely at the plates. They are a bit concave, so that you cannot load that much, right? So it's not. It's usually a plate should be a bit convex, right? So that you can load something into the plate like a bowl, right? But these plates, they are just the other way around. They are a bit concave, so that means they are highest, or they have a higher level in the middle of the plate, and that makes it more difficult to load
Yeah.
the plate, right? And and these yogurt containers, right? So sometimes they do both. So they have a concave bottom, and then they have a rim. So the container is kind of standing on a kind of rim, and so that lets that saves them maybe 5 to 10 grams, right? And so that's so terribly dishonest, right? And I mean, probably they can get away with it because they are labeling clearly the grams, how many grams of yogurt you will find inside, right? But if you compare it to a normal yogurt container of the same size, then the other one looks smaller, but maybe with more ingredients, with more
But
grams.
to be honest, the examples you just gave, I mean, they are dishonest, but they're actually more environmentally friendly, right? Because you're using less plastic than you're actually pretending to sell,
Oh,
right?
no. You are using more plastic because you need
Mm.
more plastic for the packaging, right? It's the same with the nuts example, right? Because you need to have an extra rim so that the container appears to be higher, and you don't have a flat um, bottom of the container, but the the bottom of the container is concave, so that means
Mhm.
you need more material, right? I'm really wondering if plastic is so plastic must be so cheap, right, that they can use 2 or 3 grams more plastic to save 3 or 4 grams more yogurt.
But how I mean how does this relate to greenwashing, right? Because greenwashing is when you, as I understand it, it's when you actually label a product as more
Yeah, that's
environmentally
true.
friendly, right? So how
Yeah,
does it
yeah,
relate
yeah.
to
Well,
greenwashing?
yeah, that's true. This is more maybe whitewashing, or maybe this is even the wrong, but it's pretending that the product is bigger than it really is, right? Another example from this is that especially I've seen that in Germany, but also here in Thailand, you see packaging that looks like paper, but it's plastic, right? But it looks like looks like some natural packaging made from paper, but it's not, right? Or
Mhm.
another aspect, another example of greenwashing is that they claim that this is recyclable, but then this is multi-layered. It is maybe paper, right? But then it's layered with plastic inside because otherwise the product would get spoiled, right? That's greenwashing. Yeah, that's true, right? The packaging size, right, is not really, but it's the problem is the ecological problem is that you use more amount of packaging for a smaller amount of contents, and that is not environmentally friendly, right? So that's an environmental problem, right?
Okay, okay. But
Yeah,
yeah, so if we talk about greenwashing, then
uh, yeah.
for
Let me give
example,
you, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, let me give you another example, right? So let's say if it's something is labeled uh, natural, right? So that's also a typical example of greenwashing because it doesn't say anything, right? So I mean, everything is natural. Everything has to be derived from nature in one way or the other. So it doesn't really mean anything, right?
Okay.
While if you claim it's organic, right, then it's usually assumed that you don't use pesticides, you don't use fertilizers, right? Or bio in Germany, they use the word bio. And so if you use these terms, then you have to follow certain regulations, right? But if you write
Okay.
it's natural, there's no regulation, right? Or in Thailand, I have seen, and this is probably also against the law. I have seen packaging which says juice, but then this is not juice, right? So it's assumed that juice is healthier, right? But then they mix something with sugar and colors and still call it juice,
Yeah.
but it's not juice, right? So that's also greenwashing because people assume it's healthier, it's a natural product,
Mhm.
freshly
So
squeezed fruit juice. Yeah.
so do you think there are actually any companies that uh, say they are environmentally friendly and they actually are environmentally friendly? For example, I'm wearing my
Yeah.
Patagonia shirt right now, right?
Yeah.
So the reason why I brought up H&M earlier is because they do have a green product line. In my opinion, I think if I mean I'm thinking so they do have a small green product line, but of the supply chain, uh, the rest of the product catalog that they have is not green and still polluting the earth and creating other sorts of issues around factories and so on, then there's no point in having one fashion line of green organic kind of products, right? Because
Well,
it's about what the company does overall, right? But then you have a company like Patagonia which says that it's like an eco environmentally friendly first sort of company. Do you think there are companies like that? Would Patagonia be one? Are there actually companies that are 100% eco-friendly? Is that even possible, or
yeah, I
what do you
guess
think?
Patagonia is at the forefront, right, of what is also called ESG 3.0, right? That they are very serious about corporate
Can you explain that?
environmental
What is ESG
responsibility.
3.0?
Yeah, there are three phases of environmental social governance. So companies, they have to adhere to environmental, social, and governance standards. So in the beginning, when this started, before 2000, this was more or less greenwashing. Some companies really tried, right? But it was not that much regulated. And then what many people claim is ESG 2.0. This is when investors are becoming interested and are investing also in ESG highly rated companies, because this is reducing their risk, right? So ESG 2.0 is also seen as a risk assessment tool where you try to minimize risks of a company and where things are rated and measured. But the terminology is not that clear, right? If you read papers, research papers about ESG 3.0 and 2.0, it's not that super clear which one is which, right? But I believe that ESG 3.0 is understood in such a way like Patagonia, where a company is engaged actively in not only creating less trash, but also in making a contribution in the restoration of the environment, right? And we know that Patagonia, for example, is engaging in grassroots activities. So people working for Patagonia, they are allowed to work for grassroots environmental organizations a couple of days during the year. So they are actively engaged in replacing, or they have, I think in the meantime, replaced all these forever chemicals with alternatives. And they are not using dyes, colors for their clothes, which are environmentally problematic, right? But it is a progress, right? So Patagonia wasn't doing that on one day. So they made a lot of mistakes and they learned from these mistakes. But I think Patagonia is very serious, right? I think they are not engaging voluntarily and willingly in greenwashing. It may happen, right, here and there, but not knowingly, right? So I guess that also greenwashing can also happen without you knowing, that you try to be environmentally friendly, or you think you are, right, but you're not that well informed, or you deliberately mislead consumers, like in the Volkswagen Dieselgate affair.
So are companies like Patagonia part of some governmental ESG kind of program? Do they have to meet targets, or how do we know that they are actually environmentally friendly from a
I think
verified
I
at a
think
verified level?
yeah. So there's a group called the B corporations, and they have certain regulations they are following to be extremely environmentally friendly, and not that many corporations which are B corporations, right? And in the ESG sector, you find all kinds of stuff. So I'm not sure how Patagonia is doing in terms of ESG. Probably they are much ahead of the ESG game, right? And ESG is also considered as greenwashing, right? Especially ESG 1.0 and partially ESG 2.0 has been considered as part of greenwashing, especially the environmental pillar, right? Because E stands for the environmental, S for the social, G for the governance. So companies like Boeing, for example, they're doing very badly if it comes to governance, right? This is why they had so many problems, but that's nothing to do with greenwashing. And other companies like Tesla, for example, they are not doing that well if it comes to the social pillar, because workers, they get into trouble when they want to unionize. But of course, in terms of environmental impact, electric vehicles are making a positive, having a positive impact in the long run, right? Not in the short run. So you have to drive them probably beyond 100,000 kilometers so that they become environmentally friendly. because they are using more scarce elements than conventional combustion engine cars, right? And we all know about the negative environmental impacts of the mining of critical elements and minerals, right? So in a way, right, so the whole EV movement partially is also greenwashing, because what is omitted is the sourcing of the critical minerals, right? But in the long run, right, if we get it right, if we are able to recycle batteries, then it will be a big positive change to reduce environmental impacts.
So you're saying kind of the ends justify the means. So we have to take temporary pollution into account first, just in order to reach a long-term goal.
Yeah, this is how often things are from utilitarian perspective or consequentialist perspective justified in business, right? So that this is good in the long run. So for example, Elon Musk, he will not have a problem if there are here and there some deaths that occur because of autopilot usage, because he says in the long run that will save much more lives than if we drive without autopilot in a couple of years, right? So from a utilitarian perspective, indeed, that can be justified. It cannot be justified from other ethical perspective, from a care ethical perspective, right? Or from a deontological perspective. You would rather run what is called the precautionary approach. I know you don't like this word.
So what do you mean by, can you explain the other approaches quickly, very quickly?
Yeah, the deontological approach basically would say, okay, you have to follow what Kant called the categorical imperative, right? Where you should act according such a rule where everything that you're doing could be written down as a universal law, right? And so it doesn't matter how many people get killed. Every dead person on the road is something that should have been avoided. So the end does not justify the means, right? And therefore, we should run a precautionary approach. So precautionary approach is probably very much based on this Kantian deontological approach. So precaution, we take precautions, right? So we run fully autonomous driving, maybe sandboxed or with additional cameras, additional sensors, additional radar, so that really nothing can happen. And then it's okay, right? Care ethical approach is from feminist perspective, right? Feminists say that we should in particular care about people for whom we can make a difference. And if you drive on the road, then of course, all people you don't hurt on the road, you are making a big difference for them and their relatives, right? So from these two ethical perspectives, a long range perspective which justifies that a couple of dead people here and there for the sake of having a very good system which will not kill anybody anymore in the future is not justifiable, right? But it is justifiable from utilitarian perspective, right? And everything, most of the things done in the business world are following basically a utilitarian approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so even things like ESG and B Corp and these kind of governmental standards, they are
B
kind
Corp
of
is B
utilitarian
Corp.
standards for the business world.
I would say that B Corp is pretty serious, right? So you can let's say you can and I think you can see that with, I'm not sure what is the trend right now, right? But if you ask some people if they would take a job in which they are better paid, but they have to do something which doesn't make them that happy, or where they are contributing something they are not okay with, right? Most people, they would rather take the job which is ethically justifiable with a lower salary, right? And this B corporation thing, I think this is pretty serious. I think the companies that are listed as B corporations usually they are more serious in general than if it comes to the ESG listing, right? So the ESG, this whole ESG game, of course, it is about environmental impact, it is about social positive impact and about good governance, right? But in the end, investors will not invest their money if they lose money, right? So they want to make money, but for them, if ESG translates into long-term good investment with minimization of risks, right? Because if companies, let's say, try to make a contribution in order to pollute less, right? Then that also means that they may have less lawsuits in the future. And if you have a lot of lawsuits, then this could be very expensive for investors, right? So ESG is very pragmatic in that regard. While ESG 3.0 in the beginning, right, like Patagonia, you need so they don't need investors, right? Because the company is owned in the meantime by a foundation, which basically the whole purpose of this foundation is serving nature, right? So the founder of this company, he made a very complex structure that the company will never be able to be bought by investors. And yeah, this is different with other companies, right? Where investors, they want to see that their shares go up in value, or they are paid dividends, right? Yeah.
So at the root cause of greenwashing would be that companies just have to meet certain goals, try to reach a specific market. So it's very, as you said, it's very utilitarian versus a company like Patagonia, which does not primarily, or like at its core, act from a utilitarian perspective, but rather from a set of core values from which they create their product. Would you say that makes sense? So the root cause of greenwashing being that companies simply have to check a list, find a market, sell their products. Let's say like H&M, you just have that green, eco-friendly line just for people who want affordable, organic, green, eco-friendly products, versus actually wanting to make a more profound shift. So it's more about the customer and reaching certain ESG and B Corp goals.
Well, I mean, if you look at the example you made before, right, H&M, so if they have such a product line, and if that product line is taking off, you could also imagine that the company culture and the company reputation is changing, right? Because it's also a competitive advantage if you have environmentally friendly and healthy products, right? So we know that from a German beer company. I think Lamsbräu is some Bavarian company. I think they started with one type. They were the first beer company in Germany that experimented with organic beer, right? And so when the son took over the company from his father, he said, "I want to try with one brand, right, with organic beer." And they tried that out, and it became a bestseller. So that after a couple of years, they phased out all non-organic beer. They are just selling organic beer, right? Or there's a German, Germans are very fond of sausages, so there are a number of sausage producers in Germany. I think one has been recently bought by a Chinese investor. It's very interesting. But some sausage producers, they started with non-meat sausages, and I forgot which company exactly that was, right? But it became its main business, right? After a couple of years, the non-meat sausages became its main business. So it can be really, if a company has the first mover advantage, right? So that can be very good for their reputation and very good for their investors as well.
Okay. So if we want to make sort of the transition into eco-terrorism, right? For me, it's still very hard to understand, first of all, what eco-terrorism is. Are there different levels of eco-terrorism? Does it actually already exist? And then how do we get from, let's say, companies greenwashing to actually leading to radicalized eco-terrorists? How do we get from one point to the other?
Yeah. I mean, if companies are engaging in greenwashing and consumers find that out, right, and they trusted this company, the least what you have expect is some kind of what is called the shitstorm on social media, right? And I have a very good example, but not for greenwashing, but where a company engaged in something probably they were not aware of, right? It was H&M, by the way. It was H&M, and they had a T-shirt where they showed a black an African boy, and then underneath the T-shirt or on top was written "the coolest monkey in the jungle," right? And that, especially in South Africa, that didn't go down very well. So I think the marketing team, I don't think they did that on purpose, but I think they just didn't think about it. But that went into violence, because in South Africa, South Africans went into H&M stores and trashed the H&M stores, right? So you could read that in the news a couple of years ago.
I mean, this I have to interrupt you a bit, because this example is very, yes, it's very emotionally loaded, right? So so the basis for this is history and being emotionally loaded, right? And colonial history. But with greenwashing, I have to push back. With greenwashing, I don't see how people are that emotionally loaded yet, at least, that they would actually go and storm the different shops to break things and this kind of thing. I don't see quite the connection yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, there had been some attacks on the Tesla factory and to the transformers close to the Tesla factory, right? Because Tesla built in Grünheide, they built their factory on what used to be, or at least partially, a nature reserve, right? And people got environmentally friendly and environmentally motivated people. They got quite angry. So I think it was an attack by the so-called Vulkangruppe. But maybe they were also leftish. So I'm not absolutely sure about that, right? But people, if companies for long term, and I think there haven't been many incidences, right? Maybe against mineral oil companies, right? So BP, they kind of reused their title BP as beyond petrol, right? But then most of their investment, more than 90%, went into mineral oil extraction and not into alternative energy, right? And so Greenpeace, I think, and other environmentalist group, they were demonstrating against BP, right? But okay, so one of the problems with eco-terrorism is the coinage of the term, right? So it was termed by, if I'm not mistaken, by the FBI, right? And it was defined along terrorism, right? That even if you threaten violence for ecological reasons, even if you don't commit violence, but if you threaten violence, right, with an ecological mindset or with obvious ecological reasons, then you are an eco-terrorist, right? And
how
so
would you define violence? What does violence actually mean in this context?
yeah, for example, so violence could be yeah, and this is very important that you ask this question, right? Because it could be violence against people. It could be violence against property, right? And that is included in the definition. So like what happened in Grünheide, right? So when they disrupt a transformer, burn down a transformer that is supplying Tesla with electricity, that could be labeled as ecoterrorism according to this FBI definition, because there was violence against property, right? But even planned violence, right? Even if they hadn't done it, but they would have been caught in the act of planning it, right? Even just like we are meeting here, they meet online, right? And they discuss something, and so they could be charged under this terrorism act, right? So meaning threatened violence against property is already a case of ecoterrorism according to this FBI definition. But what in fact these people have done is ecotage, right? So ecotage is ecological sabotage, which has economic impacts, right? It's expensive for the company because something has been destroyed or their operations have been disrupted, and that is very expensive, right? So if the Tesla factory cannot operate for a couple of days, it's costing them millions, right? And so this is an act that would have been coined eco-terrorist, but it's in fact ecotage, right? So this is where theorists, philosophers, ethicists, they try to differentiate, because the problem is if you call these guys who are planning something, and even if they do it, but they just inflict damage on property, but they don't kill people, they don't target people, right? So usually in this community, it is that started with the Monkey Gang Ranch, right? I think Abe was the author, an American author who coined this term. So monkey wrenching is another term for ecotage, right? So damaging property, but you try by all means to avoid harming not only humans but also animals, right? And so, but if you call these people eco-terrorists, then you have no line of demarcation between people who will kill other people, right? Because you were talking about eco-terrorism, and before we were talking about utilitarianism, right? Because utilitarianism could also be applied to this environmental problem we have, right? So the end justifies the means. Because if you have, there was recently a very interesting paper by Sovakul and Dunlop in relation to a couple of years ago in this journal on energy social science in regard to these definitions of ecotage, ecoterrorism, resistance, and so on. So one of the major questions in the opening section of this paper was, so what can you do if people destroy the environment? They know that this is wrong, but they continue to do so, right? Despite the fact that they know it's ethically not justifiable, even if they legally may get away with it, right? And from an ecological point, right, it has to be argued that we are approaching several tipping points where ecosystems get damaged. So coral reefs, melting of glaciers, rainforest destruction, the ocean circulation is disrupted. So certain tipping points, we may have overstepped one or the other. We are approaching one or the other, right? So, but it's very obvious where we are heading to. And so if companies are contributing to this destruction. You could argue from utilitarian perspective, there's a justifiability of, as Kim Stanley Robinson explained that in his book, The Ministry for the Future, killing those people who are killing the world, right? And that is ecoterrorism. That is real ecoterrorism.
I mean, I find the example that you gave with Tesla and the factory, I find it quite fascinating because in the end, they are like competing utilitarian visions of environmental protection, right? Because that's exactly what we mentioned with the batteries, right, earlier. So on the one hand, you have Tesla with like a long-term vision of reducing CO2 emissions through their cars. But so it happened, their factory was built on, naturally protected land, what used to be forests, right? But for their
Exactly.
long-term vision, right? But then you have the competing vision of the protesters, right? And the saboteurs, right? Who are kind of have their vision of, this land should have never been destroyed
Utilized.
for it should have never been utilized for an environmentally friendly company, right? It's quite competing, even though the long-term vision might be the same. It's the protection of the environment and sustainability, but yet it still led to conflict, right? So, and then you can see and I think it's probably more because it was more of a regional issue, right? So I don't think maybe the protesters, they were kind of from the surrounding areas. I don't know if they came nationwide, internationally, or whatever, right? But if they actually seen, the forest being destroyed, then you know then maybe that's why they had more emotional attachment to actually go as far as, sabotaging the factories. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it is contested, right? So, and I'm sure in the long run, definitely, right? If we are able to recycle the batteries, we are able to recycle the electronic components of these EVs, then of course it will be very positive in regards to environmental impact, right? But so far, of course, as I mentioned before, you need to extract more critical elements for electric cars than you need for combustion engine, which is not an argument to continue with combustion engines, right? But the recycling is not yet in place, right? So in that regard, we are running a pro-actionary approach, which is okay, right? Because it's not an existential risk, right? So that's different with artificial intelligence, artificial general and super intelligence, right? If you are dealing with an existential risk, then you cannot simply follow a pro-actionary approach. You have to have some precautionary principles in mind, right? What is called AI alignment in this context of AI.
Well, what does existential risk actually look like? Does that mean
Well, it
an
means,
entire destruction of the planet, of the ecosystem, or
yeah,
what's the final vision of existential threat?
existential.
Is it the complete collapse of human society and the planet and everything just completely dies out? What's the
Yeah,
actual existential threat?
yeah, that's an existential threat, right? Like things that could completely, potentially destroy entire humanity, or could destroy ecosystems beyond the point of no return.
Mhm.
So
And are we any close yet? How do we know how close we actually are um, to know how much environmental action is actually needed right now?
yeah, so I'm not a climatologist, so I cannot really answer this question comprehensively, right? But if you read the consensus of most of the um, environmentalist climatologists, this is why we have UN SDG 13, right? We need to take urgent action to combat climate change because of these tipping points and the so-called accelerator effects, right? So when you get into one tipping point, that it's like a domino effect that leads to another acceleration of an environmental problem. So thawing of permafrost, right, sets free a lot of CO2, and that has a further effects, right? So there are these kind of effects, right? In terms of justification of environmental actions, right? So far as I can tell, I think it's very justifiable to engage in ecotage. And of course, people are tried, right? Sometimes then after several trials, they are not judged that harshly. So I think these people who were demonstrating and spraying Stonehenge, I think they were released, but I didn't follow up on that, right? But I just saw on X that one environmental group I was following, they disengaged with their actions. I think it was Just Stop Oil. Just Stop Oil, if I'm not mistaken, they are disengaged, and they have disengaged their Ecotage, and now they need money for the trials, right? So I'm not sure what is happening there. I have no direct insights. But I mean, in terms of timeline, right? Timeline, as long as we are approaching tipping points and it's clear, right, from climatologists' perspective that we have overstepped one or the other and we are approaching the others, several others, then it's obviously from an ethical perspective that ecotage is justified, where you do by all means try to avoid harming people, not only killing people, but harming people needs to be avoided, right? But if we get closer to a so-called point of no return, right, where we are approaching an existential risk, then ecoterrorism would be justifiable, right? So if people just continue and they don't stop, then this could be justified also with the help of just war theory, right? Because if you look at the language that is used, right, I'm not sure if it is by accident, but if you look at SDG 13, right, so the exact phrase is taking urgent actions to combat climate change, right? So urgent action and combat. So this is war language, and looking at it through the lens of just war theory. So if we are in fact approaching an existential risk, right? And you know who is responsible for this existential risk, then from a just war theory, where you try to deal with these people, you engage, right? This is the language they're using, engage, then it would be justifiable to kill these people who are not stopping to stop their harmful environmental action, right? From a utilitarian long-term perspective, right? So utilitarianism that not only applies to humans but also applies to the entire ecosystem, right? So because you could distinguish, you could say, okay, utilitarianism applies only to humans, right? Then you are not justified to kill humans. But utilitarianism, as John Stuart Mill, not the founder but the most popular utilitarian, said that we should create the benefits for the greatest number of people, and if the nature of things admits to the whole sentient creation, right? So if you combine that also with the sustainable development definition, the Brundtland definition, right, where we should we are allowed to satisfy our needs, but we should make sure that future generations will be able to cater for their own needs, right? So they cannot cater for their own needs without the planet, right? So even if you take an anthropocentric perspective, right, so a human-centered perspective, you need to save the planet for future humans, right? And then through the back door, you would be able, as an eco-terrorist, to target what is called in just war theory deserving targets, right? So meaning polluters, extreme polluters will become deserving targets viewed through the lens of just war theory applied to ecological warfare, so to speak, right? On warfare for the sake of the environment.
Yeah, that's something. Yeah, it's really good that you explained this, because earlier you said you know, eco-targets, if you can call them that way, spraying on Stonehenge, right? Which by itself is pretty
It sounds
harmless,
pretty
right?
stupid, right?
But
And it sounds also pretty
but then
stupid because,
also
yeah,
there's other examples of ecotage, right? Because even if you try to sabotage or protest against, that there will always be collateral damage, right? So let's say with ecotage, people who glue themselves to the street so people can't get to work, right?
yeah,
Of
an
course,
ambulance cannot drive through, right? That has
yeah.
happened. So they
Yes,
also have been prosecuted
ambulance, right?
because
Emergencies,
ambulance
but
got
also
disrupted. Yeah,
interrupts normal people's everyday life,
yeah.
right? So it seems, I'm not sure if those people are acting from a perspective, and they're often young students, and maybe a bit too
Idealistic.
idealistic, right?
Yeah.
But interrupting like everyday people's lives through this, right? So maybe they don't have like a very defined kind of stand. Maybe they don't have defined their just war theory enough yet, right? Just war theory doesn't have to go to the extreme yet, right? But it could also maybe perhaps define action or justifiable action at the stage where we are right now. I don't know what you think. Like it always looks to me like they're exaggerating, they're impacting normal people's lives instead of actually doing something that targets the root cause, right?
Well, as I said, right, so I do not in its detail understand climatologists' research on what is going on, right? But I mean, there are some things I clearly understand, which is very easy to understand, right? If you think about the distribution of microplastics, nanoplastics, and these PFAS, forever chemicals, right? So you find them everywhere. Take a brain sample, take a urine sample, take a blood sample, right? Go to the Mount Everest or go to the Mariana Trench, you will find that stuff, right? And that is measurable, very easily measurable, but other things are also measurable. So thousands of tons of ice melting, not sure in which and sea level rise, right? Temperature rise, these coral reefs, in warm water areas. So these things are obviously measurable, right? And it's obvious that we at least made some contribution to that, right? This is obvious. And but there's also some hope, right, in that regard, that there are also, I just read about that, there are also positive tipping points, right? So if this EV thing will be recycled, if the batteries will be recycled and so on, if we in the long run switch to alternative energy resources, right? So we will experience positive tipping points where we can turn around things, like we could turn around things with the ozone hole, right? So that just happened a couple of years ago, that the ozone hole was getting smaller again, right? So we are not yet facing an existential risk. So I believe that the potential existential risk for artificial intelligence is much higher when it goes wrong than at the moment. And saying that, right, if we are experiencing an artificial super intelligent, it could also be the case that the artificial super intelligence is becoming an eco-terrorist, because the artificial super intelligence is detecting that there are some mammals on this planet which are responsible for the destruction of the ecosystem, and the artificial intelligence system cannot survive without the ecosystem. So the artificial intelligence system will decide to get rid of these mammals before they have entirely destroyed the planet, right? Because that's their foundation. It's just, it seems we are so stupid that we haven't understood it's our foundation as well.
Yeah, maybe, who knows, maybe in a few years or a decade down the line, who knows. But so with all of this, I've been wondering, so we are not quite, so eco-terrorism, we haven't really reached the level of eco-terrorism yet, but obviously of ecotage.
Yeah.
And before we reach like a turning point, I'm wondering, like, what would genuine environmental responsibility look like to, from, let's say, a corporate level or consumer level, so that we don't even get to that stage? So what would that look like? Do we need more Patagonias, or do we, you know, how do we even get there? How do we get there?
Yeah. So one more point, right? You sit in your aircon room, right? And I sit here also with electricity. So we are here quite comfortable, and we are not affected very severely. Okay, Bangkok is sinking, right? And the area close to here where you studied and where I work, that is already below sea level, right? So they may have a problem in a couple of years, but this is not like if you live in an area that is affected by tsunamis, that is affected by some of these environmental risks, right? And what what could be feared, right? This is what Kim Stanley Robinson, in his book The Ministry for the Future, what he fears is that there could be people who may be traumatized by heat waves, by people dying around them, and they have nothing to lose anymore, and they may become the eco-terrorists, right? Because they are so traumatized. They are, their mind is gone, right? And they just want to retaliate. If you have nothing to lose, right, you may get people who may be in this position where they commit eco-terrorist acts, right? So this is the worst case scenario in that regard, or even worse, this what I mentioned with artificial super intelligence detecting one specific mammal as the major environmental destroyer, right? But in terms of the positive tipping points, right? So if companies engage in what could be imagined as ESG 3.0, like Patagonia, yes, we need many more Patagonias, right? So if all of us would buy stuff from companies like Patagonia, and buy, of course, less, right? So overconsumption is one of the problems. But we know that Patagonia, for example, they have a completely closed loop design, right? So you can give your stuff back, and it will either be recycled or it will be reused by someone. You can resell it, or they will resell it for you. I'm not sure actually how that works. I have some Patagonia stuff, but also not that many. So this is one point, right? And in general, a closed loop, what is called a circular economy, so that we try to minimize our extraction. But a lot of people who are more ecologically minded, they also say we need a kind of different spirituality, right? So, and they claim that we have lost something that indigenous people who are living close to the environment, who are living embedded in the environment and ecosystem, what they do understand, right? So if you have to carry the buckets from a river up to your house for 1 kilometer, you know what it means, right? If you don't have electricity. So these people, they are living in an interconnected way, and doesn't mean that we have to shut down electricity and water supply, right? But we should be more cautious how we are using it, right? So if you see how often people wash their cars, and maybe there are other ways, right, to do that. So for example, what is quite interesting, in Germany many years ago, they built closed loop washing centers for cars, right? They recycle everything, shampoo and water. I'm not sure how far they are progressed in the meantime. And, you know, everything cannot be 100% recycled, right? So this is always the problem. Only nature is in a position to recycle everything 100%. So that is one thing, right? But also a rethinking of how we consume is very important. Also, the entire EVs are also not the last answer to this issue, right? A lot of people say we need a combination of fully autonomous electric and shared driving, right? So that we do not necessarily own cars, right? Like you, but you share a car with someone. And if these cars are fully autonomous, and that has environmental impact, right? Because imagine at a traffic light, right? How long it takes until the last car starts moving. But if all these cars are synchronized and shared, these cars more or less start at the same point in time, like a train, and cross the traffic light. Most likely, we also don't need traffic lights anymore, right? Because this will also be synchronized. So these
Yeah.
are things, just a couple of things, right? But there's a lot that needs to be done, right?
Yeah. And whereas what you just mentioned with the autonomous driving cars and shared driving, um, that's probably something for another call, because there's kind of a tension between, the transport industry is the biggest employer in the world, right? Especially
Mm.
things like taxi drivers and so on, right? So they would all be collateral damage and start losing their
There
jobs in
will,
this. Yeah.
there will.
Um,
That's for sure.
but yeah, that's for sure. But I think, I mean, before we finish off, because we've already been at it for like an hour.
Yeah, 1 hour, 40 minutes.
Yes, so I want to just let you finish off maybe with some final thoughts on what gives you hope. Where are we with all of this? So it's quite easy to talk about the negatives, but like just what gives you hope?
Well, I think there are two things that are giving me hope. When I look at companies like Patagonia, right? I see more companies like Patagonia coming up. If you think about the Swiss company Freitag with their recycled truck top bags, Fjellraven, right? All these outdoor companies, they notice that they cannot simply produce outdoor stuff without being more or less environmentally friendly, right? Also, the EV, the advent of electric vehicles, maybe artificial intelligence will help us to simulate certain things, right? Will help us to make better decisions about recycling, upcycling, right? Not only recycling, but upcycling. And another thing that gives me hope is that, as you know, I'm teaching students in these areas, and I think a lot of students over the last couple of years, I do understand that they have understood that we are having a problem here, right? And that something needs to be done. If this represents a major shift, I'm not sure, right? But sometimes you need only one person to start a big movement, right? Think about Gandhi, or think about Greta Thunberg, who started this Fridays for Future movement, right? So this is a bit of hope, right? But to be honest, I'm rather a pessimist, so I don't have that much hope,
Yeah,
unfortunately. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So I think we need
Personally,
to, yeah, we need to do more. This is not, it's not sufficient.
I I agree. I think we definitely need to do more, and
This is not happening by itself.
yes, yeah, and then we are also very energy, we are very technology dependent, right? So the right technologies need to develop first in order to um, be able to maintain the system. and to grow it in a sustainable way. But yeah, I mean, thank you. I think we had a very fruitful conversation today. Thank you a lot.
Yeah, thanks for your inspiring questions.
I'll try my best.
You did,
But yeah,
yes.
I think that's it for today, and we will be back with another episode
Sure.
very soon.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. Take care.
Goodbye. See you.